Hello, beautiful community. Today, the gods didn't want me to get up, but it's 11:30 in the evening here in London, and I just have. So for today, the gods nil, me 1. I'm going to push my luck too much. Just 1-0 for today. So let's have a little chat. Now, we're going to talk about J.D. Vance calling the public historian Niall Ferguson a globalist and a peddler of moralistic garbage for advocating stronger support for Ukraine and not submitting to Putin, as Ferguson claims the Trump administration is at risk of doing. I don't want to do this like a point scoring boxing match, partly because both sides lose in this exchange, but partly because it's about us trying to learn something about screwed up stuff that happens to our politicians, but also screwed up stuff that happens to our public commentators. So let's quickly start with what Niall has said. Let's create space for Niall. Niall needs space. So Niall can go over here. There we go. This will not stand, said George H.W. Bush in August 1990 about Saddam's misbehavior. But Ferguson applies it to today and says future history students will be asked why this stopped being the reaction of a Republican president to the invasion of a sovereign state by a dictator, because this is not a Republican president, but an ex-Republican president, Niall. And we'll talk about that. Here is JD. This is moralistic garbage, which is unfortunately the rhetorical currency of the globalists, because they have nothing else to say. Now notice that this is a well-oiled reply to his own demographic. Notice the length of JD's post. Notice how much time it takes to write a post like that. And notice that JD has a position in the Trump administration. He's not just an advisor. So he's supposed to be very busy. But the vice president is spending a lot of time writing extensive, nearly articles on X. So what do we make of that to start with? Well, I think here we're pulled in two directions. It's part of J.D. Vance's job to spend a lot of time doing media theatre. That's actually a part of his job, and it's a feature and not a bug of Trump's politics in prioritizing appearance over reality, or at least prioritizing appearance over reality in presentation, right? While behind the scenes, there may be some people who are trying to actually change reality, dismantle civil service and so on. There is an argument that pulls the other way, and that says in 2025, politicians have to communicate to the public extensively. And I agree, but that has to be constructive and trust building, and of course that's JD's reply here is not. And I really do believe that you can't get out of it. The only way you don't do it, if you're in high power politics, is really if you just can't stand personally doing it. Somebody like the UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, might not stand really doing it. But otherwise, it would be advisable for one to do it if one wants to be a constructive politician, which literally means, it's midnight, you're still working, and you shove your face into your smartphone and you say, if you're the British Prime Minister, hi Brits, what's going on today? What's things changing in the world? Thinking of you tonight. You need that. you need much more show, don't tell in the way politics is run at a moment of crisis of trust. The trouble is that in practice, there's the risk that anybody who really wants to shove their face into the phone very much will be less likely to be somebody who wants to shove their face into the phone responsibly. For 3 years, President Trump and I, Vance says, made two simple arguments. The war wouldn't have started if Trump was in office. And second, neither Europe nor the Biden administration nor Ukrainians had any pathway to victory. And then he makes, let's skip a little bit, then he makes 5 points. Number one, while our Western European allies' security has benefited greatly from the generosity of the United States, they pursue domestic politics on migration and censorship that offend the sensibilities of most Americans. Well, there is certainly, we won't discuss this long because we actually did an episode on Vance's speech at Munich. Now, there is certainly a legitimacy crisis in Western democracies and a very big gap between, in particular, centrist politics and the sentiments of lots and lots of citizens. And the issue in which this gap is widest is indeed immigration. And there is certainly also an issue about construction of discourse in modern democracies, where centrist political narratives are pushed as though they are ones that citizens already agree with, when they don't. Having said this, whatever Vance can say about woke or out-of-touch centrist politics that ignores the interests of working-class voters in particular, we can say worse about him and Trump. We can say how they're going to be worse for stressed and busy and hard-working Americans. We can say how they're going to be worse on censorship and so on. So that's a point that carries weight, but then has to be returned to Vance with even more weight the other way. Number two, Russians have a massive numerical advantage in manpower and weapons in Ukraine, and that advantage will persist regardless of further Western aid packages. Well, I think that's false, because that simply depends on the extent of Western support for Ukraine. Now, I do think that's predicated a bit on Western democracies being in a better shape than they are. That's the link I talk about between democratic incapacity and strategic incapacity on the foreign stage. But the point is that, you can't describe this as a fixed reality when, in fact, it's a consequence of how you choose to describe that reality up to a point. So if the West had supported Ukraine more, it could have actually had various kinds of systematic advantages over the Russians that they don't have. So yes, please, you can say you're going to give up on support, but this is BS, right? So don't just make, if you want to make a bad decision, make a bad decision, don't add BS to it. Number three, the United States retains substantial leverage over both parties. Well, it certainly has substantial leverage over Ukraine, less leverage over Russia. Number four, ending the conflict requires talking to the people involved in it and in starting and maintaining it. So this is actually extremely subtle of Vance. He is slightly contradicting Trump here by implying, I think, on balance, that the Russians started it. But the problem with what he says here is that talking is not the same as submitting to. Number five, the conflict has placed stress on tools of American statecraft, American stockpiles, and so on. Given all of the above, we must pursue peace, and we must pursue it now. And that's a very important element of what the Trump administration is trying to do. They want to prioritize rapidity over sustainability. So Niall responds, having visited Ukraine every year. Well, let's say a word about Niall. Niall started his career in the late 80s, I think, at Cambridge. And I don't know what his first college was. Then he was at Peterhouse briefly, which is a college with a remarkable history in the 70s for being a kind of a bastion of Thatcherism under the guidance of historian Maurice Cowling. And it was both a bastion of Thatcherism and the bastion of homosexuality in the 70s. And you might think these two things are exclusive, but they're not. And then Niall went to Jesus, Oxford, and that's when he began to become a superstar, really, in his 30s. I recall his public interventions in the 90s around humanitarian intervention, around the Western intervention in 1999 in the former Yugoslavia, which he opposed, and I shared that perspective at the time. And he was very early age writing very major and impressive, serious academic books. And one of the early books of Niall's that I recommend still is a book called Cash Nexus, which is really a book questioning certain, if you like, neoliberal assumptions about how economics determines politics. It's a beautifully written book. Now, Niall's more recent work I'm not familiar with. It's more public work in many cases. And I have followed his career less closely since he left. But what's best about Niall today is that while he sometimes, as we'll see, outsources his support to post-truth authoritarian populists, he himself isn't one. And we need every conservative right-wing historian or public thinker we can get who are responsible. So that's all I've got to say about Niall. Let's move on to seeing what he says. Having visited Ukraine every year, but once since 2011, I think I have an informed and realistic view. Let me give a warning here about how we have an absolute pandemic of experts stretching their knowledge more thinly than it really can go. It's a very, very common practice for people to sort of spend, 3 weeks in China and then, go on CNN and talk as though they're an expert on China, whereas in fact they would be dismissed by country experts. So we have an absolute epidemic about that. I don't think Niall is at risk of that because he isn't, on the Ukraine issue at least, because he isn't talking about Ukrainian domestic politics in detail. But I'd warn you in general in our culture about the absolute outbreak of disease around this line. Right? We've got an absolute saturation of people who do these 2-week country visits once a year and haven't got a clue about what is going on in the country they're visiting, and then speak and give themselves authoritative equivalence, right, with people who've spent 30 years studying these places. So that's not a knock on Niall. I haven't noticed him do anything wrong on Ukraine, but it's very much a warning about just how much BS you're exposed to by people who authoritatively talk about places they know very, very little about. There are many, many exceptions. I mean, in the UK, for example, the public intellectual John Gray has a freakishly legit knowledge of Russia. That's quite rare. So that's an observation worth keeping in mind in how you negotiate the informational environment. And again, you might ask me about me. I don't think I would call myself a Russia expert. I would call myself a very minor public intellectual who speaks with some close knowledge about some regions but tries to stay away from others. And despite sort of extricating myself from the tag of being a country expert, as I'm not on Russia, my sense of Russia is freaky, right? It's very rare to have a sort of a generic public intellectual who has so much concrete knowledge about a particular place. And when that's the case, we have to recognize it, but we also have to be clear about what a culture of, stretching your knowledge 11 feet when it should only go 3 we're living with in the papers, on mainstream TV, and on social media. Neil says, we'll jump forward a little bit. I supported Trump's campaign for re-election last year. Well done, Neil. Consistently predicted his and your victory. Well, I think that's correct and impressive. Not difficult, but impressive. As a lot of people didn't. And welcomed the vibe shift the victory represented. the vibe shift right now is excellent. I've also supported the president's previous calls to negotiate peace between Russia and Ukraine. In fact, I agree with all 5 points you make. Do you, Neil? Really? All of them? And I praised your Munich speech. But I cannot understand the logic of beginning a negotiation this difficult by conceding so many crucial points to Russia. And then Neil goes on and on and on and on, and I don't want to read that. He ends with saying, but you and President Trump campaigned last year with a slogan that dates back even further than George W.H.'s words that I quoted, and the phrase was peace through strength. I wish you luck. Now, the position that Neil expresses is the position of a very large number of people in the Republican Party. It's a position of a very large number of Republican senators. But they're quiet about it. It also happens to be Marco Rubio's position, but he's quiet about it. So it's worth making this side point about how much cooption and self-censorship there is, and how we have to call it out. But you only call it out once you're sort of sympathetically empathetic what they're doing. So what would Rubio say about what he's doing? Rubio would say, if it's not me, it's going to be somebody worse, and you're going to have an even worse outcome for Ukraine, you're going to have an even worse outcome for the United States if I'm not there, so I might as well be there. How close is that, in my view, to being persuasive? I think it's completely unpersuasive, even though I can imagine Rubio himself being persuaded of it, because when you have access to power, you persuade yourself very quickly that the things that are convenient for you to believe might actually be true anyway. This is a destructive political project, the Trumpian project. I won't discuss now why I think that's the case. So I'm afraid that 0 points for Rubio for that excuse. But it's always there, and we have to now watch it closely, because we have this situation where former conservatives are jumping on post-conservative or ex-conservative political projects without changing their clothes, but actually with changing their politics. So we have to be very careful. And you relate to that even in your life on a small scale. I mean, let me give you a completely facetious example. Imagine if in running my YouTube channels, a couple of years ago, I decided to prioritize the Russia collapse story, that Russia is collapsing. That would have done something to my views. Let's say I would have doubled or tripled them. And I could have said to myself, look, I'm going to make lots of videos about how Russia is about to collapse. Because the reality is, A, this will get my videos seen by many more people. And my analysis, even though I will skew it in favor of an account of Russian collapse that's untruthful, my account, even though I'll skew it, will still be so much more informative and healthy and sophisticated than the rest of the content about Russia's collapse, that it's actually going to be both good for the audience and good for me. I'm going to have more views, more people will see my content, and because my content will be corrupt, but still less corrupt and superior to the other content out there about Russia's collapse, it looks like it's a win-win-win-win-win. I get some power, Marco Rubio says, and the Trump administration becomes less bad. Win-win. I get more views, and more people out there get access to an improved analysis of Russia, even though it does perpetuate the false narrative about Russia's imminent collapse. Right? So the answer to that is no. No. It doesn't matter if 95% of people would do it. No. No. You don't do it. And what do you get in exchange? You get 77 people who really, really love you. Legit. So let's read my response to Niall. Niall is making an historical mistake. Trump's submission to Putin isn't a flaw of his administration. It's a symptom of a global authoritarian trend of which Trump is part and of which Putin is part too. And now you see here we have to be very careful and not make an exaggeration. There is this old philosophical joke about the philosopher who was seen standing in his kitchen and banging with his fist on his kettle. And when asked what the hell he was doing, he said that he hated steam locomotives. And then he was told, but this isn't a steam locomotive, it's a kettle. And he said, well, you have to kill them when they're young. Now, we don't want to do that, right? We don't want to prematurely say that Trump is a sort of early onset family relation of Putin. But we also don't want to underplay that point. We don't want to underplay how far some of the forces we have discussed as causing democratic decline, right, are global and therefore are obviously going to cause similar political phenomena across the globe. What's interesting in the similarities that exist between Trumpism and Putinism, what's interesting about these similarities is precisely how not inherited from Putin they are. It's precisely how organic they are, right? When we talk about Putin, I know so many people love to write, well, what kind of P-tape has Putin got, right? It must be really bad, right? But I recommend a different direction of emphasis, right? I recommend to say what's remarkable about the Trump administration is that it is mirroring Putinism in some respects, right? But precisely because it is an organic phenomena of which both it and Putinism are an expression. You know, what's remarkable about the growing similarities of Trumpism and Putinism, they're still limited, but they're growing and they're substantive, is that they are not a case of malign Russian interference in our democracies. They're a case of organic consequences of fairly stable global economic and political forces that are causing various kinds of crises of distrust in institutions, various kinds of crises of depoliticization. So I go on. In the election, Niall's choice, so Niall supported Trump. And can I square support for Trump with being a responsible public intellectual? Yes, I can. But God, it's a stretch. It's a stretch. Certainly Niall's version isn't acceptable. They're going to be fine. They won't attack institutions too badly. And yeah, it's going to be all right. No. I mean, somebody could tell some kind of story that a reckless and destructive politics is the only solution to the West's malaise. You need to run it more in that direction rather than saying Trump's going to be normal enough not to be a threat to democracy. So I've never seen that story in person persuasively. I think it's, well, in fact, I think it can't be persuasive, but what I'm allowing is that a public intellectual could be responsibly misguided so as to end up in that position. Or, perhaps more plausibly, a public intellectual could recommend Trump in such a way that the recommendation for Trump is very much not the point of their account, just a very small byproduct, and there's enough richness elsewhere in the account for us to take it seriously somehow. But it's very much a stretch, and I certainly reject it in Niall's case. In the election, Niall's choice was between the Democrats, a bankrupt technocratic centrism exacerbating the crisis of democracy, and the ex-right, which is Trumpist anti-institutional populism out to break the democratic game. On his own terms, Niall should have rejected both, or chosen the Democrats as the lesser evil. What is very easy for me to accept is a public intellectual who says, for the love of Christ, do not vote for Kamala Harris. Please do not vote for Kamala Harris. I can accept that, but I struggle with vote for Trump. Now, my personal position is not really very relevant. You know, I'm somewhat tempted to like Kamala personally, even though I don't like her public persona, but I think she's actually nicer behind the veil of it. And she's sometimes confused about what's a veil and what's her. But so I'm quite soft on her personally. What I'm not soft on is technocratic centrism that's lost touch with, you know, the population, because Trump's the result of that. But despite that very critical attitude to the Democrats, and I tweeted today that the Democrats are like an orchestra in the world in which musical instruments haven't been invented. You know, they're trying to play, but they don't know what to do. They're lost. They can't make sense of the world, a world that their own previous actions helped cause. So despite all of that, what I want to say is, if I were an American citizen, I would have gone out of my way to vote for Kamala Harris in this election. It would have been an extremely negative vote, but an extremely clear vote for me. So on his terms, Niall should have rejected both or chosen the Democrats as the lesser evil. Instead, his pro-Trump choice will continue to fail him at home and abroad, because it isn't a conservative choice. It's an ex-conservative choice in favor of a project out to dismantle the very counter-majoritarian institutions on which constitutional conservatives depend. So what we're witnessing here is this thing that I think I first talked about in the Dugan video on the main channel, where there is this slide of conservatives into being ex-conservatives. So what we have is authoritarians who are in conservative clothes but are no longer conservative political actors, right? This is the reality of the ex-right, and it happens like water coming to the boil imperceptibly. So many people on the ex-right still think themselves that they are the right, but they're not the right anymore. They're the ex-right. They're out to break the democratic game. The key difference between the right and the ex-right isn't extent of right-wingedness. It's whether you're committed to the sustenance of counter-majoritarian institutions or whether you want to break them. So the difference isn't how extreme you are in your right-wingery. It's rather whether you're a constitutional right-winger or an anti-constitutional right-winger. Niall has some expectations around foreign policy and around domestic policy too, that probably require constitutional right-wing politics. But he is opting for anti-constitutional right-wing politics and then crying about it. And that's going to be the predicament of a lot of people. So we've got to watch it not just in terms of our conservative politicians becoming ex-conservatives, but we've also got to watch it at the level of conservative public commentators, right? while themselves potentially even remaining conservatives, as Neil remains, outsourcing support to ex-conservatives while fudging the key distinction between what is a conservative and an ex-conservative. Right? That's very, very important. Let me just mention one final thing that I think is quite important. And that's that there is also a danger in a different kind of commentary. The commentary of people like Anne Applebaum and Tim Snyder, who are very different. I mean, Tim is very much a compassionate, left-leaning centrist. Anne is a conservative. Anne is, a very constitutional centre-right conservative. So what have they got in common? Well, what they've got in common is that they're offering a critique of Trump. They're offering a critique of Trump's fascisation, of Trump's breakage of institutions, and it's wonderful. I think Anne has been as fantastic as anybody in articulating this business of how you drift from being right-wing but constitutional to being a post-conservative, to being an anti-constitutional conservative. And she's brought our attention to how this trend has developed in Eastern Europe too, long before it happened here. And again, a lot of Tim's critique is very timely, right? For instance, he's one of the first people to say, don't comply preemptively. But there's a risk with that cohort of commentary that they perpetuate the very politics that caused Trump by simply critiquing Trump, but not critiquing both the politics, the centrist, the technocratic centrism of the 90s and 2000s, and the social forces that brought Trump about. And sometimes that's not even an objection to what they're doing, because they wouldn't necessarily disagree with that critique. Partly would. I think they partly, probably both, don't create enough space for it. But it's more the case that it's simply that their output is focused on Trump critique, but not on emphasis on the social forces brought it about, right? Because the problem is, if you got Kamala Harris would have led to worse Trumpism later, right? That's the problem. There's also a risk of that kind of commentary, sort of liberal anti-Trumpists who defend the politics that caused Trumpism into existence, while offering extremely and urgently valid critiques of Trumpism, for which we must be extremely grateful. Lots of love, and talk very soon.